Right, a little bit of complexity theory. Anybody into kind of like complexity science? Yeah, I bought some books about complexity science. Like, no, this is not even a joke, this is a true story. I started reading them and they're really hard, quite surprisingly complex. But part of complexity science is chaos theory, okay? And it's an interesting way to look at human performance particularly. So let's think about the human body as a complex system to differentiate from a complicated system. A Swiss watch is complicated, but we can take the pieces apart and we can ultimately understand how it works. When we've got a complex system, what we're talking about is multiple systems which are all interrelated and interdependent. So a change in one is going to affect a change in another one. Now, when we've got this idea of complexity theory as it relates to human movement, we've got order. All right, I'm going to move around. So over, you guys can still hear me, right? Andy, can you hear me? Got you. So when we're over here at this side of the spectrum, we've got everything which is stable, organized, structured, and somewhat rigid. Okay, those are good things when it comes to human movement. If we're going to go and ask ourselves to do something with increasing complexity, what's going to happen is we're going to travel further through this process where we move from order into something more like chaos. Okay, to be able to perform well, we need a balance of both. I'm going to come to that in a second. But let's kind of, if I give you an example, let's say that you've got a client who's doing a shoulder press, they've got 5 years training experience or something like that, so they know how to lift some weights. When they come in and do a shoulder press, pretty stable, pretty organized, pretty reliable based movement, we know what we're doing. If they are struggling, standing, we can make that situation or that environment less complicated by sitting them down. So we create more stability in the system, all right? If we take that same person, that same athlete or client, and we go and ask them to do a freestanding handstand push-up, right? All of a sudden, we throw a load of complexity at them. And that system isn't going to know particularly well how to handle all of those variables because we haven't got anything rigid to rely on, yeah? So when we're starting to think about how do we move to a place where we are managing chaos, we need to understand what that journey looks like. Now, we know what people look like or what happens when people go too far into chaos. Right? And I'm going to use this term affectionately, but they turn into motor morons. Right? They can't move, they don't know what they're doing. They're the sorts of people that when you give them a perfectly executed demonstration, what they do is then entirely different to what you've just shown them. Right? There's so much variability in the system that they can't execute to a high level. So what we're interested in doing from an athletic performance perspective and decreasing injury is moving people to a place where we can thrive in the edge of chaos. Because to be athletic, we need a certain component of order, we need some components that are stable and in place, and we need enough variability to be able to handle randomness so that we can express our movement patterns effectively. Everyone with me on that one, all right? So we can't be super rigid, we can't be entirely chaotic, that sweet spot is going to be in the middle. Enough stability for quality, enough freedom and fluidity to be able to move and express. Now, when we go through that, this space here is how do we prepare for chaos? Because when we think about the shoulder, and I'm going to take you into a little bit of functional anatomy to explain why in a few minutes, but the shoulder is vulnerable to chaos. All right. So let's kind of dial this down a little bit. Because we've got now the fitness industry, the landscape, like I've been doing this for 15 years. That thing, like, you know what, wasn't really a thing when I started. Now what we've got is a huge amount of complexity which has become commonplace in the fitness industry. And my hypothesis is that people are redlining the shoulder too much. We're revving the engine on a daily basis, and that's why we're seeing a significant number of shoulder injuries. And I'm going to show you some evidence to back that up in a minute. If we know this from an applied perspective, because this is what we effectively are doing now in our business, is that we are working with people who have got banged up shoulders to help get them back to doing what they want to be able to do. Now, just before we go into the next part of it, I'm not at all in the space of don't train, don't do anything risky, don't do complexity. That's not me at all. My background is performance sport. My interest is in getting you to a place and your clients to a place where you can perform to the highest level that you want to, doing whatever it is that you want to do. So there's no judgment from the side from me. The reason this is going to talk about that which must not be named is because that's a lot of the clients that we see. So there's a big problem there, and I want you guys to go away feeling better equipped to be able to go and start to work with those clients yourselves. I can't tell you how many clients that we see that are ex-rugby players now doing CrossFit, previous shoulder dislocations, now feeling unstable overhead and snatch patterns, right, and getting banged up as a result. So here's the hypothesis then, a fairly bold statement, but I'm going to take you through why I think it's important. Coaches are not adequately preparing the shoulder for the demands that we place upon it. And that's where I want to help you and give you some more tools to think about as we go through the next part of the session. So, a little bit of evidence as we step back onto some fairly thin ice potentially. So I've got a few studies for you to have a look at, right, just for some numbers to illustrate a point. And we're going to look at, you know what, and we're also going to look at a couple of other sports where there's a significant amount of chaos. Just as we go through this, you guys are coaches so you understand it, bear in mind that this is a non-contact sport, right? So the level of chaos relative to something like rugby, which we'll look at in a minute, they're fairly different conversations from an athletic preparation perspective, right? Non-contact sport versus contact sport, and the influence that we can have as coaches on a non-contact environment, in my opinion, it should be much more significant, okay? So 2016 study, and what we've got is 187 participants, 23.5% had a shoulder injury in the last 6 months. The reason that I think this slide is really important is if you guys are in that space where you're working with these kind of clients, is nearly 40% of those people who had a shoulder injury it was a previous exacerbation of a previous issue that they'd had. So we know, giving that respect, that individualization of who's coming into the gym and what's their story. If I come into, like until recently was training at a box in Nottingham, when I come in at a relatively athletic level, okay, I can Olympic lift, I've got some good context and experience in gymnastics, I know about some metabolic conditioning, may not be high level, but I can participate at quite a high standard in a sense of I can do the stuff, I can do the things that make up the thing. But I've had 2 shoulder reconstructions and multiple dislocations. So what happens when you start to go through more complexity? Am I ready for it? And I see other people coming into the box who haven't got any real athletic background, coming through and then also getting thrown at a fair amount of complexity. And it's in here where trying to manage those things is where we start to have some problems, and that's the piece we're going to plug in today. Next one, 4-year study, 3,000 participants, 30% had an injury in the last 12 months. Of those, 39% were shoulder related. Okay, so it's a reasonable, let's say 1 in 3. Okay, and if you look at any other sport, if you go to cricket or rugby or something similar, you're going to see a similar statistic. 1 in 3 is roughly where you're going to be at with shoulder injuries. Final one, 2021 paper. 414 participants completed the study. 284 had an injury in the last 6 months. 60% of them, just under, was a shoulder-related injury. It's a significant number of shoulder injuries. And even those that weren't injured would cite shoulders, 37.4%, as being the primary site of most injuries okay? So we know there's a problem, okay? Let's have a look at another one. Now this is the phase that you pull when you're about to captain the British and Irish Lions in 8 weeks' time. Alan Wynne-Jones dislocated his shoulder against the All Blacks in a preparation game, dislocated his shoulder, not for the first time. However, found himself 8 weeks later on the plane to South Africa to play against probably the most physical side in World Rugby, played every Lions test as captain and didn't dislocate his shoulder. Okay? The context for that conversation is important because a recent study that came out, 2022 paper, 55% of uninjured players are playing with some level of shoulder dysfunction. More than half. So what we know that if we've got players that are playing with some level of shoulder dysfunction, that there are a higher level of risk in those players for something more catastrophic or serious traumatic injury. You can argue in rugby that, okay, it's rugby, we're going to have shoulder problems. Yeah, we are, and I agree that that's never going to be something which we can eradicate entirely. But if we can take a guy with a dislocated shoulder and 8 weeks later put him on the plane to go and play against the most physical side of World Rugby, I'm probably pretty confident there's something that we could do for those 55% of players to put them in a better position, right? We're just not doing it, essentially, because that's the intensive rehabilitation piece. But what lessons can we learn from that we could actually apply to those uninjured players? Now, when I go to work with different gyms or clients or whoever it might be, like I did a session with a group quite recently, 5 uninjured athletes, coaches, working and training at a high level. Every single one of them wouldn't have presented as injured. Every single one of them has got shoulder pain and had pain when we sort of put them into some relatively high force-based positions. So there's a whole piece of like, who are the people that you're working with, and then are they at risk of injury? And this is not again, I'm going to reiterate, it's not a don't do anything conversation. It's not super conservative. It's please address that problem. Where I get a lot of resonance with clients that we work with is because I know what it's like to have a dislocated shoulder. Has anyone dislocated a shoulder here in the room? Yeah? That feeling of instability is not nice, right? So when you're coming and when you're working with me, I know what it's like to feel unstable in overhead position. So you've got to recognize that you might see, oh, okay, it's just a shoulder injury, it's a bit pinchy, it's a bit unstable, whatever. Dislocated shoulder, the rehab isn't fun, it's pretty boring. If you have to go down a surgical route, you are 6 to 12 months out of doing what you want to be able to do. It's a significant issue for people. And your risks of recurrent dislocation go up massively if you've had a first issue of dislocation. Again, not fear-mongering, just respect it for what it is, because the shoulder, as we're going to go into in a minute, needs a little bit of support. Last one from the research base then, so boxing, they cited the shoulder as being the most at-risk joint of injury or source of point of injury outside of impact-based issues. So aside from broken knuckles, wrists, lacerations, it's the shoulder. 14.5%, not a massively significant number for some, but if you are going to have a shoulder injury in boxing, you are nearly 50% likely to dislocate your shoulder. Does anyone work with combat athletes? A couple of you? Yeah. We do. We get a lot of people who can't throw punches, can't hit pads for a number of different reasons, and I'm going to basically give you some of the cheat codes of how you can solve some of these problems. All right. We talk about performance being driven by design. If you want to know how to train the shoulder effectively, you need to understand and respect the design of the shoulder, because it's different to the hip, even though we will group the same as a ball and socket joint. All right. So I'm going to wander. I appreciate it's annoying if I'm like in and away from the mic. I'm just going to go and wander a little bit. So let's take a little bit of a functional anatomy tour. So what's our functional anatomy like? People are like, should be all right. Okay, no one's like looking terrified. So we talk about the shoulder. We're essentially talking about 4 joints, right? Scapulothoracic, glenohumeral that we all know pretty well, acromioclavicular, sternoclavicular joints, all right? It's the articulation and integration of those 4 joints which gives us shoulder function. This guy here, the humeral head, is 3 times bigger than the socket that it sits on, the glenoid fossa on the scapula, which means that the whole of that humeral head can't be in contact with the joint surface at all times. When we're starting, there's a study that came out, and it's not really on a sporting population, but it's an interesting illustration. To carry a 10-kilo suitcase, they found that the glenohumeral joint contact surfaces, so the congruency forces to keep this ball on the socket and the socket on the ball, was 240% of body weight for a 10-kilo suitcase. So what does that look like when we are going to be on deadlifting some of the numbers that some of your clients are going to be deadlifting or pressing? Significant amount of demand on the joint forces around that joint specifically. Now the shoulder is designed for mobility. You can't have mobility and stability at the same time. So we then have this super mobile joint which has to be relatively unstable, in inverted commas, to allow you that freedom of movement. So what we then have in terms of controlling everything that's going on around the shoulder is that those muscles basically acting on the shoulder to try and hold and control position. Remember, we need to be able to keep the ball on the socket and the socket on the ball whilst that scapula is moving around the rib cage, effectively in that upward and downward rotation pattern. We see loads of people getting pinchy overhead because they can't get enough scapular upward rotation. And we haven't got enough rotator cuff strength to keep the ball in the socket. We're going to talk about that later. So when we start thinking about chaos, respecting the design of the shoulder and going, that's how it's designed, super mobile, lots of forces acting on it. And remember, that scapula is a false joint, right? It's floating there in space and suspended entirely largely by muscle forces. So the best way that I've seen this described actually is an Eric Cressy analogy, but think of it like a piece of tent canvas, and we've got guy ropes pulling in different directions. If we've got some of those guy ropes pulling way too tight, we're going to start to see a distortion in the canvas, and that's going to affect the ability, therefore, of the scapula to be able to move. So balance, coordination, rhythm is so important in having a high-performing shoulder. Everyone's still with me? All right, nodding at me, that's good. So let's kind of bring this around into what you guys are going to do. So we're going to talk a little bit around this idea of the edge of chaos and effectively how you can start to think about prioritizing certain areas of your training programs to be able to cater more for preparing the shoulder for the demands you're going to place upon it. So the first one is athleticism. Fairly sort of big subject in some areas because you can apply it to lots of different things. But in 15 years of working with athletes and general public in different contexts, one thing that I know is that if we take athleticism as a key part of our philosophy, clients are going to do way better. It gets us away from thinking purely about kind of muscle function A to B and more into the space of thinking, well, what can you do? Because particularly with the shoulder, a shoulder that can do more things, has more movement options, can perform better because of the design. So if we've got some more work in our programs where we are starting to get strength, stability, and control in different shapes, rather than just in here or here, when we start to find ourselves in more chaotic positions, the brain is like, oh, this is cool, we've done this before, we kind of know what it's like to have these force acting on the joint, and therefore we're going to get better performance. I talk about this a lot, but neural is the key, right? In terms of if the brain is comfortable, has got context, has experience, it will give you more performance. As soon as the brain is a little bit like, okay, this is new, this is a bit chaotic, this is now a movement that I don't know that well, and you're now asking me to do it whilst I'm tired, coupled with something else, we're going to start to find ourselves in a place of chaos. Now the shoulder has more degrees of freedom than any other joint in the human body. So it's got lots of movement options, if you've seen. So if option A, to get overhead, isn't available, the brain is like, well, you're telling me you need to get overhead, so I'll help you get overhead. We did it. All right, well done, we got overhead. Okay, but we've done it in a way which is suboptimal. And if we do that too often, we're at risk of then starting to chew up some of that quality of that movement pattern, and that's when people are going to start to have problems. It can vary from a shoulder which niggles a little bit, to it feels unstable, to it's just painful at night and when I wake up in the morning, to I can't get progressive overload. Our big thing and our philosophy from a dynamic shoulders perspective is how can I get your shoulder to move well, biomechanically move well, pain-free, with confidence, precision, and control. Part two of that is how do I then also get you to get progressive overload in the long term to achieve your sporting, athletic, and performance objectives. The piece that's important in there is you've got to do point 2 as well as point 1. So many people find themselves doing trying to get long-term progressive overload, but they're doing it whilst in pain and not moving well. That doesn't work long-term from somebody who's been there and from now somebody who's working with people in the same space. The number of complex shoulder problems that we work with where people have had problems for 2, 4, 5, 6 years even is significant. And it takes us a point of needing to re-educate and basically install some more athleticism into their training to get them to start to move in different ways. I've got an ex-professional rugby player that I'm working at the moment. Put him on you guys know what a crab walk is? Never played crab football at Scouts or something like that, it's like that. Cannot get into shoulder extension. Just like, not even that it's painful, but just cannot move in that way. So what does that say about the capacity and athleticism if we just can't move in certain ways? It's not great, right? That thing, that can't be named, that's taken a good step towards improving athleticism. I like it for that. I like ring muscle ups. See, I've got a big background in calisthenics. Muscle ups, handstands is a big area that I'm interested in. They're all great, but what happens if you haven't got the stable components to be able to do those well, and what happens when we start to ask the clients or athletes to do those with increasing levels of fatigue, with high intensity? What's the brain going to do if it can't nail that down? Okay, the brain's going to be like, sweet, we'll do a chicken wing muscle up if you want. I guess not a good position for us to be in. Now this is a definition that I really like, and I often used this one before, but it's from the National Strength and Conditioning Association, which is the equivalent of the UK Strength and Conditioning Association, but based in America. Now I've just gone here and highlighted a couple of bits for you around to bring in this link between our order and chaos link, okay? So I'm going to move. If we think about our order pieces in our spectrum of order to chaos, the ability to repeatedly perform, okay, rigidity, stability, consistency, control, structure. I want to be able to repeatedly perform is order. A range of movements, literacy, which we'll talk about in a minute, with precision. Okay, I want the control, that's order. You can't move with precision without some level of stable components and order. and confidence in a variety of environments which require competent levels, stability. And now we're going to start to talk about our edge of chaos. Now we can start talking about motor skills, strength, power, speed, agility, balance, coordination, endurance. I'm all for that. Do that, let's do that, right? That's athleticism. But we can't be athletic if we haven't got those stable pieces in place. And what I'm seeing from the clients that we come to is it's evident when we screen them and work with them that they haven't got those components in place. We've often skipped that step of get started. All of a sudden we're in complexity and we haven't gone through the phases appropriately to earn the right to be able to then go and express fully. So what we see is a decrease in performance, a lack of ability to be able to get significant progressive overload, and we start to see people get banged up in their shoulders and we get pain, which then recircles that whole issue back around. So how do we develop more athleticism? And this is one of my takeaways for you that I want you to go and think about. Think about play. Think about literacy. Think about moving in new ways. When we've kind of put this sort of stuff out amongst coaches who've started using it, and we'll get them hanging, and we'll get them rotating on single arms, and we'll get them doing monkey bars, we'll get them crawling on the floor, we're using gymnastics rings, we're encouraging hand balancing skills, controlled. Do you know what happens? Shoulder starts to feel really good because we're giving it a lot of what it needs. Tons of dynamic stability in different positions and patterns. Variability in terms of context of producing forces in different ranges of motion. And we're starting to clue that brain in the whole time with here's all the different ways that you can move. It builds you up to a place where you've got, go back to the design, the shoulder with lots of movement options. If we train those movement options with a view or through a lens of being more athletic, guess what? The shoulder performs well. And for me, in my background from strength and conditioning, our number one priority is don't get injured, especially non-contact injuries. Like that is huge for me. If we, in a professional environment, as from the sports that I've worked with before, got a non-contact injury, I would see that we'd not, in some cases, done our job as well as we could have done. And it's finding that balance the whole time of being performance-orientated and driven, but doing enough to make sure that we don't get non-contact. If we get a contact injury, okay, it's going to happen, all right? And we see that all the time, okay? We can definitely have more influence on that. Okay, number 2, let's talk about endurance, or a little bit more maybe sort of around like fatigue resistance, okay? Particularly around some of the musculature of the shoulder. So this is a physios in the room. I know Alex is here. There's maybe Brett as well. You guys will know some of this stuff, but rotator cuff fatigue is a primary cause, one of the primary causes of shoulder issues. We'll talk a little bit about why in a second, because I'm going to break it down to a very kind of like micro piece of the conversation. But when we started to think about the shoulder and the design and the load that we're placing upon it and the intensity that we're starting to place on it, in terms of like levels of fatigue or the ability to be able to go and do a significant amount of work for an extended period of time, if that shoulder isn't able to maintain congruency of the joint, then it's going to have a problem. And I'm going to show you a graphic in a second. The other one to think about here is this study that was done by Ian Horsley, who leads the upper limb rehabilitation for the English Institute of Sport. So if you're an elite athlete in the performance system and you have a shoulder injury, you go and see Ian. So they did a study on rugby players, and basically they found that proprioception, so your joint position sense and kinesthesia, decreases in end ranges under fatigue. So put that in kind of layman's terms of going, if we are tired, we lose joint sense, where we are in space, in end range positions more than mid-range. So we're going to now go tired overhead, it's vulnerable because we're getting that fatigue is more significant. Some of the other stuff then, rotator cuff musculature. Okay, we've got our 4 muscles of the rotator cuff. Back to your onboarding piece around functional anatomy. If we look at the orientation, origin and insertion points of the muscle, and we look at the pennation, or the angles, or the fibers, we can see that the primary job for all the external, internal rotation stuff that we talk about is what? Keep the ball in the socket. All 4 of those muscles are pulling to try and maintain that relationship or that connection between the humeral head and the glenoid fossa on the scapula. Some of the research will also suggest that if we get, and this is going to be variable, but this just to give you a highlight of some of the margins that we're talking about, 1 to 2 millimeters of uncontrolled translation can be the difference between a shoulder injury and not. It doesn't have to move far. But if we think about, I'm going to move, these guys, And what we actually have here, when we look at the rotator cuff on a cadaver, what we'll see is it's not actually like, it's not, those rotator cuff muscles actually blend into the joint capsule. The joint capsule on the shoulder is super mobile. It's designed for mobility, but it basically does all wrap around into the joint capsule in that idea of then just holding the shoulder on the socket. Now this is a quick video. I'm going to come back to this one, just highlight a few things. Everyone's squeamish, look away now if you're squeamish. You're about to see a on-pitch pop. Okay. Do you know what? I actually pressed the wrong button then. I didn't want that slide. I thought I'm going to go with it. I'm going to go with it. I'm going to go back a slide. We can watch it again now. So what's interesting about that slide, or that video, it's from the NRL. So the Broncos are playing a Storm. It's the 80th minute of the game. Broncos are down 48 points to 6. What does that tell you what the Broncos have spent the last 80 minutes doing? Tackling. All right, they're tired. So we now go through, we receive a kick in the backfield, in the goal area. Player picks up, gets the ball, gets a nudge, comes over, lands on his elbow, and it's enough just to knock it out. Now, we don't know the exact history of that player, all right? But what we can see is that it highlights the point of the conditions. Fatigue is going to cause potentially an increased risk for us. So when we're starting to think about, like, people take the piss all the time when I talk about band rotation type work, all right? They kind of think it's funny, oh, external rotation work. Most people that I see are undertrained when it comes to rotation-based work, particularly external rotation, let's say, is going to be the bias. Largely because a lot of what we do is going to be anterior dominant. So and what we'll see over a period of time is that the external rotators will detrain across the course of a season, potentially, unless we are proactive about doing something about them. Now, I'm interested in this because what we'll find is that I've got athletes that have come through that are strong, okay? They're lifting some decent numbers. If I put them into a side-lying external rotation with a 2.5 kilo dumbbell, they can't do 12 reps on a 4-second eccentric. Okay, we can say what we like about the value of those exercises, but if you can't do 2.5 kilos, but we can press 100, like there's a problem in terms of how we can maintain that structure. So a lot of the work that we do early doors, and this is stuff for you to take away, of going, do some high volume, slow eccentric type work, build capacity in here. Because what it's going to do for you is by building and increasing the endurance capacity or the fatigue resistance in your shoulders, and particularly around the rotator cuff, is going to keep the ball in the socket when you then go and start doing more complex things. So you might want to go snatch, wall ball, muscle up, like do whatever you want, but understand that when you get that muscle up, when you've done that amount of volume, this is what's going to keep your shoulder moving well. Okay, it's going to keep the ball in the socket and the socket on the ball, and the stronger that is, the more balanced that is across your entire kind of athletic profile, the less translation is going to be and the less potential risk of injury. If we pair that with good scapular upward rotation, we can actually get into a good overhead position. And then another little bit that I see all the time is anybody who does like, you know what? Like when do you last eccentrically decelerate a bar from overhead? Never. Why? Because you're on the clock. So eccentric strength is not going to be particularly good from a performance perspective. So what we see is that people can't come from upward rotation to downward rotation in a particularly well-controlled manner, meaning we crash down and then we can't get back up again because we're already now 5 meters behind the start line because we're starting in a crap position. So some eccentric strength work as well. We do a lot of work in that early phases to get that strength going back in. And again, strong people can't handle that type of intensity. And when I go back to my point around athleticism, why is that relevant? Well, if you can identify the things that you're not very good at, that's the most potent thing that you've got in your training strategy to get better. If you only ever train the stuff that you're good at, fine. But what about the things that you can't do? And why don't people train the things that they can't do? Because they're not very good at them and they're hard. But getting people to crab walk, and you might look a bit stupid in the gym, but if I rediscover or reclaim that physical human movement, what does it do for my muscle-up performance? Gets me into my deep dip position more comfortably without this guy going forwards in the socket, yeah? Because I see that all the time. We're moving fast, we're explosive, we come through, slam. Okay, how much control have I got when I'm already tired to stop that humeral head riding forwards in the socket and causing some problems? Yeah? Do you want to watch the dislocation video again? We're going to have to because it's next to the slide. I could click through it, but let's watch it again. 80th minute, down 42 points, comes in, takes a knock, pop, falling on an outstretched arm. There could be a number of other things going on in there, slap lesions and all sorts of stuff. That bit. They're kind of now, like, when I last dislocated my shoulder, they take you to hospital and they put a nice little crutch under your arm and they gently just like lever it back in. Yeah, it's not quite as bad as that. Let's move on. Okay, last one, and then I'm intentionally leaving a fair amount of time for Q&A because hopefully you're going to have some prompt to some interesting thoughts and discussions. Rate of force development. Okay, this is massive. So we often talk about stability from the shoulder as we have done, and we talk about the rotator cuff. What about how fast that shoulder can produce force, the speed? So when we talk about rate of force development, we're talking about the ability to produce maximal force in a minimal amount of time. The shoulder needs this from a protection and a performance perspective. So if we take our rugby example, if I'm going to go in for a hit, the speed at which that shoulder is neurally going to fire up and create stability is going to then allow me to create a stable base from which I can transfer force, performance, I can hit harder, and it's going to do a good job of keeping the ball on the socket. It's going to keep it stable because we get that firing rate. And when we start to see stuff around training and athletes' kind of athleticism, how often do we intentionally train rate of force development with our clients? I don't think we do it particularly well. When we're starting to think about gymnastics-based movements, we would do quite a lot when we were doing around calisthenics type stuff of working from a dead hang into an explosive high pull as a progression towards a muscle up. If we go back to our order and chaos piece, if I'm in that dead hang and all I've got to do is get as high as I can without worrying about the transition, I'm starting to get better at playing in the edge of chaos because I'm not asking that complexity piece. It's exactly the same as learning Olympic lifting and finishing with the high pull and not worrying about the catch. Because the high pull allows us to get that triple extension, the bar height, and then we can teach the catch. If we put people into the catch too soon, they start thinking about the catch, they don't triple extend, and we don't get the bar height. Same thing with the shoulder, but now we're asking people to go from a hang position to a high pull and into a transition. We're asking that rate of force development to happen very, very quickly. Now, if what happens when we pull from that bottom position, if we don't have rate of force development, the shoulder's gonna be like, oh, crikey, we can get going, but like we can't create the stability around the joints and keep it in a good shape. So that humeral head has the opportunity to start to migrate and move around, and we end up in funky positions. We can test this now. So we're using force platform data. We can actually go through and we can look at rate of force development and peak force, and we can look at the guidelines, or we can look at asymmetries from left to right and see where our potential risk factors are. It's pretty scientific, but it does give us that indication of being able to say, look, here's a particular weak spot. The most effective thing we can do for you and your shoulder is to improve rate of force development from a protection perspective. So just to highlight the point on this one, we're going to go from a ring muscle up position, and you know what I'm talking about, like with this sport, is like, don't think about the elite. It's not about what we watch on TV at the games. It's about the guys in the gym 5 days a week at 6:30 who just got out of bed and are now going to go and put the foot on the gas and start to redline the system. Okay, they're not going to be moving brilliantly at that time in the morning. So how again are we preparing them? Because what's going to happen here, take away the kip component, we're in a dead hang shape in the closest picture to you. Not a lot of tension, we're in a slack shape, and now you're going to come through, and at that point where it counts, you're going to go and try and create rapid rate of force development to stabilize the shoulder so that you can produce force. You have to create stability before you can create tension from a force output and power perspective. It just doesn't work any other way for the shoulder specifically, or particularly. So dead hang position, we're then going to come through, we're going to drive the hips up, we're now in a row position, and what are we going to do to finish the movement? Rapid internal rotation. So we're going to go from dead hang, flexion, through internal rotation to explosive shoulder extension, which, if we're not careful, is going to allow the shoulder to migrate forwards in the socket or anterior glide. If we start throwing that shoulder through too quickly, that's when we start to have this uncontrolled translation. We start to bang up the front of the shoulder, which causes some problems. So one of the things that we can do very easily is just to start to think about preparing the shoulder for more explosive movements using exercises designed to improve rate of force development. This doesn't need to be particularly arduous. A big thing for me from a philosophy perspective is I just want you guys to go away and think about some stuff. I intentionally don't come in and go do 4 sets of external rotations on 12 reps for 4 times. Like, because there's so much of that on social, you can go and find methods are millions, right? What my big thing is around, can you critically evaluate why you're doing that with your training program, and what are all the other options that you could have used, and why did you choose that one? And then to also critically look at what's your context in your environment, who are you working with, what do they need? And just because a training methodology says, well, this is how we structure training, it's a warm-up, which if we do a snatch in the main body of the warm-up or the main body of the workout, we often warm up with a snatch, which seems a bit strange. But when we come through that, like, where do we slot this stuff in? Because our business is doing really well from broken athletes that are training high complexity environments. But I don't want that to be the case. I want people to be able to have the tools so they actually can sort themselves out and they're getting the right kind of coaching to ensure that they are safe in the environments that they're operating in and can get the results that they are effectively putting you, the coach, in responsible for getting for them. So, I'm going to wrap it up and then we can have a chat. Bring this in. I thought I'd put something hard-hitting in there just to finish off with. Taken from the Hippocratic Oath, right? First, do no harm. In sports performance, number one priority. Do you know why? Because if we harm an athlete because we aren't doing a good enough job from our physical preparation perspective, we get fired, essentially. It's that bad. So because if you are constantly not keeping reducing the injury burden, or athletes are getting non-contact injuries, you ain't going to stay in performance sport very long. How seriously do we take that statement in physical fitness and training, in the fitness industry? It's a question. I'm not going to give you the answer. Go away and think about it. Because when I see these methodologies, I'm like, we aren't taking care of that, in my opinion. First, do no harm. Okay, so are we looking after the needs of our athletes? Because I take the responsibility when a client comes to me, or I've looked after athletes in the past, right? Someone said to me, an EIS interview years ago, athletes get one chance. You as a coach get many chances. I have many opportunities to coach an athlete to be successful, which then means that I am successful. Athletes get one career. So I always took that extremely, that level of responsibility is quite significant, because that person is then trusting me, and especially as a private contractor, I wasn't employed by an organization. That athlete chooses to work with me, and it's my responsibility to make sure that they can achieve their greatest potential. That's the job, right? So I still look at that now. If that means that sometimes I err towards the side of caution when I'm progressing an athlete, I'm okay with that. Because what I know is that injured athletes can't win medals. So the longer that I can keep people training well at a high intensity, consistently over the long term, for the sake sometimes maybe of a session or two or even a week, that long-term consistency is always going to win over taking risks too often and potentially then causing a drop in our ability to be able to actually turn up and train. Training is what gets you the adaptation. So we don't really talk about this too much, but when we named dynamic shoulders, it came from a very intentional space of where we were trying to sit in the industry, which is essentially between late-stage physiotherapy and rehabilitation and performance training. So we're trying to move people through this reconditioning state of, like, you come through that initial stage of traumatic injury rehabilitation, if that's where you're at, and now we're going to take you through to a better position with the ability to leave the process when you work with us with the tools to not come back. So my kind of commitment to people is, you'll leave with the 4 or 5, maybe 3 exercises that you need to do to manage your shoulders. Having all the rehabilitation I've done over the years for the dislocations and surgeries, there's 3 things that I do on a regular basis that I know my shoulder needs. And if I don't do them, it's not great. If I do them, it's absolutely fine. And it's not complicated stuff. It's moving in different positions and patterns. So I challenge myself in terms of the literacy. I play with movement. I have play as a big part of my program. What does it feel like to move like that? Can I translate from that position on the rig to that position in lots of different ways? Am I looking after my cuff and scapular control muscles, essentially, or stability muscles, if you want to call it that? Have I got enough endurance in that shoulder to do what I want to be able to do? And can I maintain a good position? And then can I start to then think about power, force, speed, output to do the things that I want to be able to do? So dynamic shoulders came from the definition of what dynamic means from a physics perspective. So go back to our order and chaos conversation. Dynamic is characterized by effective action, order. I want control, I want some levels of stability. That's a good thing to be able to have those. If I want to do a freestanding handstand push-up, I need to be able to control enough variables to execute the movement pattern. That's a training process. But it starts with effective action. Can I maintain control of the shoulder and the system? We're then going to start thinking about the motion and equilibrium of forces, importantly the equilibrium of systems under the action of forces. So now, can I take that equilibrium, or can I maintain that equilibrium, the control, and then start to apply forces to that system? Can I scale it? So I've got control, now I want to maintain control whilst progressing. And the final point there is it relates to force and power. We are performance orientated. So do you want to go and snatch X amount of weight, throw at X amount of velocity, play at X amount of rugby tackles in a game, whatever it might be? That's our performance outcome. But for us, it stems from having control of basics and scaling through and earning the right to progress, to be able to go and do greater things in high levels of complexity. It's a great thing to be there, but where we want to be is in the midline. Not too much order, not too much chaos. That edge of chaos is where we can start to prepare the shoulder, build that robustness, that endurance. It means that it's less likely to tip into that complexity where we start to then see we're going to have problems and we're going to break down.